Hello, YouTubers. Hello, YouTubers. I'm Useful Idiot. Welcome. And today I want to talk about Georgia. And the reason why I want to talk about Georgia is because upcoming in, I believe, June 27th, they are going to be signing one of these association agreements with the Eurozone. And let's remember that this is the same event that sparked the Ukrainian conflict and the Ukrainian so-called revolution. And we also have some commonality between this situation in Georgia, the situation we had in Ukraine, and incidentally, the situation we have in Moldova. And I already did a video about Moldova, and I will attach that below. And so we have all three of these countries being involved with these association agreements with the Eurozone. So Georgia and Moldova are coming up on June 27th. And in Ukraine, we already know how that played out. And we also have Georgia talking about joining NATO at some point. And but what makes this interesting is not only do we have the confrontation in Crimea in the Ukraine, and then these breakaway regions, including the Donetsk Republic now. But in Georgia, we also have two breakaway regions, enclaves, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And a lot of you may remember that there was a war in that region in 2008. And I'll get into some more details about that conflict in a minute. But and then Moldova also has a breakaway region, an enclave that has a lot of Russian presence. And I should also add that Russian troops actually still occupy these enclaves in Georgia, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia. And they've seceded, and Russia's one of the few countries that's recognized those occupations and those secessions. And Georgia, of course, still claims this area as part of Georgia. So anyway, we have this partnership agreement with the Eurozone coming up in June, and then in September they might get this what they call a map to NATO, joining NATO. So here we have again the United States and the Eurozone are really putting the screws on Russia right now, and putting this whole situation with Georgia and Moldova on the fast track in spite of what happened in Ukraine. And it's not to say that we're going to see the same kind of drama that we saw in Georgia that we saw in the Ukraine, or in Moldova that we saw in the Ukraine, because for the most part, Georgia is united in its effort to lean towards the West, and very, very pro-West. And in fact, last March, Parliament was unanimous in support of EU and NATO membership. And Georgian forces actually served in the coalition of the co-opted in Afghanistan and in Iraq. So we've had some Georgian combat troops in the field. So a very small country, 5 million, and they have a democracy with a fair amount of the same kind of corruption and post-Soviet collapse, cronyism, and still a lot of influence from people outside of the country, both from the Eurozone and in Russia. So anyway, just something to keep our eyes on to see if we see some more confrontation. Like I say, nothing on the level that we saw in Ukraine, but still there are some problematic issues. And having Russian troops occupy Abkhazia and South Ossetia, with Georgia joining the EU in this agreement, could bring up some hot points. And but since this whole story is relatively dry, I thought I'd throw in a little bit of quick history, since a lot of people don't really know that much about Georgia overall. It's another one of those countries that's right in the specific zone for a lot of invasions, a lot of fluctuating borders, a lot of expansions, a lot of disintegrations. They've been invaded by everyone, the Romans to the Mongols to the Khazars. So interestingly enough, a lot of the population that's ended up being in Israel now are what they call Khazar Jews, and they are actually not from the region of Israel or ancient Israel or otherwise. They're actually from more of this region of Georgia. Um, so anyway, going back to, let's just go back to 1783, where Russia and East Georgia signed a treaty that Russia would protect East Georgia from the Persians. But then 1785 and in 1795, both the Turks and Persians invaded, and their capital was burned, and the population was massacred, and Russia did nothing. And then in 1801, Russia annexed East Georgia. So we see this pattern we see in modern age where we have a lot of realpolitik, a lot of broken alliances and opportunism. So Russia annexed East Georgia, and then 14 years later they annexed West Georgia. And so Georgia was absorbed into the Russian Empire. And then after the Russian Revolution in 1918, Georgia actually declared independence in the midst of the Russian Civil War. But that independence was very short-lived. So let's remember that. It's kind of interesting. In the modern age of the last couple of centuries, Georgia only existed for mere months, but it had a taste of independence. And so then in 1918 to 1920, after World War I, it was under British protection. And then the minute the British left in 1921, it was attacked by the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union put together a puppet government. There was an uprising in 1924, and that caused the Soviet Union to just absorb Georgia into the Soviet Union, and this is what they did from 1924 to 1936. And then World War II came along, and interestingly enough, 700,000 Georgians served in the Soviet army, of which half were killed. 350,000 were killed. Let's remember their population today is only 5 million. So that's a substantial proportion of their population. And then in April 1991, they declared independence shortly before the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then they've had pretty rocky birth as a free country, like so many other nations in that region. Oddly enough, in 1992, there was a military coup. From 1992 to 1995, there was a civil war. Then they had wars with Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And then in 2003, there was finally had the Rose Revolution, and the Russians withdrew. And then by 2008, we had the war that I talked about earlier, where Georgia actually attacked South Ossetia, and then the Russians confronted them militarily, and Abkhazia joined the fight as well. And that is now at a stalemate, more or less, like I say, with Russian troops still occupying those enclaves. Here it is 6 years later, and now Georgia approaching this EU agreement and possibly joining NATO. So maybe we'll be hearing more about Georgia soon. Maybe not. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.